Isn't it a great day to be a Christian? This morning we're going to be looking at a passage from one of the most famous sermons ever preached. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is found in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. At the end of Matthew 7, when he finished preaching this, verses 28 and 29 say, "The people were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes." So we're going to look at the Sermon on the Mount beginning in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. Jesus taught with authority because Jesus was the Son of God. He told his listeners what was expected of them as his followers and how they needed to live their lives. And so that's what we're going to be looking at, what Jesus expects us to do, how Jesus expects us to live. Let's begin in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. "And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you." There's an old teacher joke that I heard told a lot of times. It says Jesus finished that sermon, and when he finished, then Simon Peter said, "Do we have to know this?" And Andrew said, "Do we have to write that down?" And James said, "Is this going to be on the exam?" And Philip said, "Is there a study guide for this material?" And Bartholomew says, "Oh, what came after poor?" And John said, "The other disciples didn't have to learn this." And Mark said, "Could you make copies of that?" And Matthew said, "I need to go to the bathroom." And one of the Pharisees who was present asked to see Jesus' lesson plans and asked Jesus, "What are your performance standards and your objectives in the cognitive domain?" And Jesus wept. Now that's not exactly how it happened, but the passage that we just read is something that we as Christians need to know, because it is going to be on the exam. It is something that we have to use to prepare for our lives. Verses 3 through 12 of this passage are what have become known as the Beatitudes. If you look up the word beatitude in the dictionary, it says a state of utmost bliss. So Jesus says, if you'll do this, if you live this way, if these things are characteristics of your life, then you're going to receive great blessings. Lord willing, next Sunday evening, we're going to start looking at each of the Beatitudes. We'll have a series of lessons on all these different things that Jesus said we need to have in our lives. But this morning, I want us to concentrate on the next verse, the one that we stopped right before, verse 13, where he said, "Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt have lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is henceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out, to be trodden under foot of men." You heard people talk about they're the salt of the earth. That's something that's really good. That's something that people are bragging on. But what about the people that were gathered there? Think about it. Those weren't exactly the elite of their generation. Those people weren't what we would consider to be the salt of the earth. Let's go back a few verses. Go back to Matthew chapter 4. And let's see who was listening to Jesus. I'll start reading in Matthew 4, verse 23. It says, "And Jesus went about Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease among the people. And his fame went throughout all Syria. And they brought unto him all sick people that were taken with divers diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, those which were lunatic, and those that had the palsy, and he healed them. And there followed him great multitudes of people from Galilee, from Decapolis, from Jerusalem, and from Judea, and from beyond Jordan." When Jesus told those people that they were the salt of the earth, that was probably quite a shock to them. They realized they were just common people. Some of them had all these terrible diseases. Some of them had been healed from some terrible sicknesses. They didn't have any idea that they were going to be in any position of influence, and yet Jesus told them that they were going to have an impact on the whole world. Jesus knew something about the world and his listeners that they didn't understand. So before we start looking at his listeners, before we look at the people he was talking to, let's look at what Jesus was implying about the world. So we got to understand the condition of the world before we can appreciate the importance of salt. Why did Jesus come to earth? Because it was filled with sin and hopelessness, and it was full of decay and full of things that were leading to sickness and death. Sin was on a rampage in the world, and God saw that. He wanted the world to be helped, and so he sent Jesus. The world's corrupt, the world is offensive, the world's polluted, it's decaying and dying. Let's look at some verses that describe the condition of the world. Go to Psalms, number 14, 14th Psalm, and begin in the first verse. Psalm 14, beginning in verse 1, says this: "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They are all gone aside. They're all together become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one." Jesus knew that the world was in terrible shape. When he's talking to these people, he's telling them that they're the salt of the earth. He knew that the earth was full of fools that deny God. The world is still full of fools who are denying the existence of God. The world needs help then. It sure needs it now. We'll talk more about that later. But why is the world in such terrible shape? We'll go to the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 17. According to Jeremiah, it was a heart problem. Jeremiah 17:9. Jeremiah 17 verse 9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" And that's not the first time that the world's been all messed up. The world was messed up when Jesus was talking. The world's messed up now, but the world was messed up a long time before that. In fact, it was messed up way back in Genesis. Go to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6 verse 5 says this: "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart." The world was a messed up place. The world's still a messed up place. And Jesus said that it needed something different. And his followers were supposed to be different. Jesus said that his followers, the people that were chasing after him, needed to be salt. Well, how does salt work? Well, salt works because it's different from the things that it comes in contact with. Some of those differences are contained in the Beatitudes. Lord willing, we'll be looking at some of those things later on. But only when the salt is different from what you put the salt on does it make a difference. It doesn't change anything if it's just like what you put salt on. And so Jesus is saying that his followers need to be different. When we're going to understand what Jesus meant when he said, "Ye are the salt of the earth," we need to understand some things about salt. Now, the salt that Jesus was talking about then is the same thing that's in our salt shakers at home. It's the same thing we keep by the stove to season our food. It's the same thing that we keep on the table. It's just common table salt. Well, how is table salt used? Well, first of all, it's used as a preservative. If you rub salt in some meat, it prevents meat from decaying. In fact, one of my favorite foods is country ham that's been preserved with salt. It just makes it better. It keeps it from rotting. We need to understand that salt doesn't make bad things good. Once it's rotted, you can't put salt on it and restore it, but it's a preservative. It keeps things from going bad. So salt is a preservative. Number two, salt is an antiseptic. Salt can kill germs. People, when you go to the doctor, they'll tell you sometimes you have a sore throat, gargle some salt water. Why? Because that salt will kill some of those germs that are in your throat that are causing you to be sick. Now, salt is not a miracle drug. You can't eat salt and get well if you're sick, but it can kill some of the germs because it's an antiseptic. We talk about, people don't throw salt in a wound. Well, they say that because a long time ago, that's how people treated wounds. They realized that the salt could kill the germs, so they put salt on wounds. The problem with that, it hurts. But it is an effective antiseptic in cuts and scrapes because it kills the germs. So salt is a preservative, salt's an antiseptic. But my favorite use of salt is it makes things taste better. Salt is a seasoning. Food scientists have said that from a culinary perspective, salt has many desirable properties. They say adding salt improves the sensory properties of virtually every food that humans consume. They say salt makes sweet things taste sweeter. That's why all dessert recipes just about call for a sprinkle of salt in dessert recipes. A lot of people put salt on their watermelon. Why? Because it makes the sweet taste sweeter. It gives you a contrast. So salt is good for a seasoning. But think about it. Salt all by itself doesn't taste very good. I mean, nobody wants to go grab a big teaspoon of salt to top off their meal. That's just not something that we like. But it makes just about everything else that it comes in contact with taste better. In fact, bland foods are not very good unless you put a little salt on there to make it taste better. So when we understand what salt does, then we can better understand what Jesus was telling his disciples that they needed to do. Christians are to be salt. We're supposed to act as a preservative on the world. Remember, a preservative is something that keeps things from rotting. And Christians are supposed to try to keep people from sin. You ever been around somebody, you call them a wet blanket? Why? Because they kill the good time. They're not wanting to do all the things that you want to do. Well, sometimes Christians are supposed to be the wet blanket. We're supposed to keep people from wanting to be involved in the sin that they want to be involved in. We're supposed to be putting out the fire of their desire. When we stand up for what's right, sometimes we keep other people from doing things that are wrong, from doing things that are questionable, from being involved in things that they shouldn't be doing. Look at Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, beginning the very first verse, says this: Be ye therefore followers of God as dear children, and walk in love, as Christ also hath loved us, and hath given himself for us as an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not be once named among you as becometh saints, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. Paul's saying, y'all don't need to be doing all this kind of stuff. That way you'll have a better influence. You'll keep other people from doing that kind of stuff. There's a positive effect when a godly man or woman is involved in a crowd. I've had people tell me, we don't do those kind of things when so-and-so is with us. Why? Because they respect so-and-so. They know that he doesn't believe in that or she doesn't believe in that. And so they're not going to do things that they would do otherwise. So Christians should be a salt to keep other people from doing things they shouldn't do. Go to 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2, beginning in verse 15. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. Christians should be living in such a way that we keep other people from losing their eternal life. We help them preserve their ability to abide with God forever. So Christians are to be salt because we're supposed to be a preservative. It helps the world, helps keep people we know in the world from going off into sin. Christians are also supposed to be salt because we're supposed to act as an antiseptic. Again, that applies to the sin in the world. But people notice a difference between godly people and worldly people. If we live a godly life, we can stop the trend towards worldly behavior. We need more Christians in leadership roles. We need more Christian coaches and teachers and elected officials to help stand against sin, to help kill off some of the germs that are leading us to the sickness of sin. Go to John chapter 17. John chapter 17, Jesus is talking. Let's begin reading in verse 14. He says, I have given them thy word, and the world hath hated them, because they're not of the world, even as I'm not of the world. I pray not that thou shouldst take them out of the world, but that thou should keep them from the evil. They are not of the world, even as I'm not of the world. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. And thou hast sent me into the world, even so have I also sent them into the world. Jesus was sending his disciples into the world to be different. They weren't supposed to be like the world, so that the world could see the evil of sin, so that the world could recognize that sickness and avoid it. So we get one more passage on this point, Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Christians are supposed to be different to show the world the danger of sin and how to live without the sickness of sin. Number 3, Christians are to be different because we're supposed to be a seasoning agent in the world. Without God, life's dull and bland, and people keep looking for things that are exciting, and sometimes they turn to things that are not good. We need to live Christian lives in front of them to show them that with God, everything is better. Without God, people are on a never-ending quest for pleasure, to fulfill their lust. With God, we should be on a never-ending quest to please Him, to do what He wants us to do. And to do that, like salt, we should make everything we come in contact with a little bit better. That salt effect should change our lives so that other people can see what being devoted to Christ can do for their lives. So we should be showing the world there's an alternative to the despair that's going on around about it. Go to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse 4. Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Let your moderation be known to all men. The Lord is at hand. Be careful for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Imagine what kind of impact we could have on our friends and neighbors if we lived according to this passage. If we rejoiced, if we were thinking on positive things, if we were talking about good things, if we were living our lives the way that God wanted us to live, wouldn't we make everything we touch just a little bit better? That's what Christians are supposed to do when we're being the salt of the earth. So we're supposed to serve as preservatives to keep people away from the rot of sin. We're supposed to act as antiseptics to eliminate the germs of sin. We're supposed to be acting as seasoning to try to make everything we come in contact with just a little bit better. Look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 again. Matthew 5:13 says, but if the salt have lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? What happens when salt loses its saltiness? Now, you know, there are actually skeptics that attack the Bible here. They say, well, the Bible can't be inspired because if you know anything about chemistry, salt can't lose its saltiness. Salt is a very stable compound. If you take a jar of salt, you put it up on a shelf, you leave it 100 years, you take it down, it's still going to be salty. Salt doesn't lose its saltiness. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus didn't say the salt would quit being salt. He said it would lose its saltiness. You ever been cooking, maybe you're making a pot of soup and the lid comes off the salt shaker and you dump all that salt into your pot of soup? Do you just throw it out? No, you just add more ingredients to the soup. You put more water in, you put more vegetables in, you put lots of other things in there to dilute the salt. The salt's still going to be salty, but you keep adding ingredients to it to kind of spread that out so it's not as powerful, so it's not as strong. That's what Jesus is saying. He said that sometimes we get so caught up in the world and we get diluted. We're not effective anymore. We're not being any different than they are. We're losing our effect on the world because we've been diluted by the world. We can't preserve, we can't protect, we can't season anything because we're becoming just like they are. He said if the salt has lost its savor, it's worthless. It needs to be salted. It needs some more salt. It needs something to be different because we're not being any different from the rest of the world. Jesus said it's good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men. It's useless to God. It's useless to other people. To be an effective servant to God, you need to be different. You need to be the salt of the earth. To be the salt of the earth, you need to be a Christian. It's the only life worth living, the only death one would dare to die. Christians form the church. We're the ecclesia, the called out. We're supposed to be different. We're not supposed to be like the rest of the world. We're supposed to change the world instead of being changed by the world. If you've never obeyed the gospel, you can be a Christian. You can become salt this morning. How about those of us that are Christians? I want to look at one more attribute of salt that we didn't discuss. Salt makes people thirsty. You ever eat something really salty? What do you want to do right after that? You want something to drink because salt makes people thirsty. It's a chemical response. It says when you consume salt, it raises the sodium levels in your blood. Your thirst response is triggered, so you'll drink water. Adding water to your system will balance out the extra sodium, making sure you don't have too much or too little salt in your system. Remember when Jesus was talking to the woman at the well? John chapter 4. She came to draw water. He said, give me something to drink. She said, why are you talking to me? They had this conversation. Jesus answered, go to John chapter 4, verse 10. Jesus answered, said to her, if thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, give me to drink, thou wouldst have asked him, and he would have given thee living water. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? Jesus answered and said to her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again, but whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up to everlasting life. Does being around you make people thirsty for the water that gives everlasting life? Does it make people thirsty for Jesus? Does being around me make people want to be more like I am, to be more in keeping with the word of Christ? Are we being the salt of the earth? You need to respond to the Lord's invitation this morning. You can do it right now. Won't you come? We stand together as we sing.